Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene day 2 of a 5-day program on our endangered planet, our endangered species, our endangered ecosystem. And as we open today, I want to just bring in a book that I just finished called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. It's one of the most extraordinary books out there in the following way. What she has done is, as someone who just loves nature, but is also as a scientist, what Suzanne Simard has accomplished in this work, which is a New York Times bestseller, is to show that the way trees working with, mycelium and all kinds of mushrooms and other things beneath the ground and through their leaves have a neural network that is basically like the brain. And that if you just internalize the import of that finding, and you couple it with a finding that came out of England about a month ago, where scientists are actually studying how the little mushrooms communicate and the roots and so forth. What they're discovering is that they're sending electrical impulses to one another that are structured essentially like human language. If you take that in, the Copernican revolution that we're being invited into is that we speak not as something separate from nature, but we can use language because nature has already figured out how to use language. And our neural networks in our brain aren't separate or distinct from nature. They're basically a replication at a certain level of complexity of what nature's been using for millions of years. It was a very moving experience for me to read this book and really feel afresh that we are nature, that everything we do it because nature has already done it. And we're going to be getting into some pretty tough content today. We're going to be talking about the death economy, which is predicated on this bizarre cognitive dissonance that somehow human beings are separate from nature. And Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, is just an exquisite journey back to who we most essentially are. So it's in that spirit I want to greet everybody today and want to invite you, before we dive into our program, to just take a moment and center yourself in your body and close your eyes if you can and attune yourself with your heart and just feel for just a minute nature, the trees. Think of all your capacities as a human and realize, maybe even for the first time, that we have all this because our mother developed it first and then bequeathed it to us so we could be better children in her womb. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my great pleasure, in fact, privilege to introduce the conveners of our Endangered program who have been regular contributors to Humanity Rising. Tom Eddington, the founder and CEO of Endangered Global, and George Cappannelli, the founder and CEO of Age Nation, who together have put together this program. And it's one of many that they've done and will continue to do for Humanity Rising, because our relationship with nature, just like our relationship with each other through the democratic processes, are fundamental to whether we are going to survive as a species and craft together with nature a more abundant future. So Tom, George, welcome. And I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks for the opening comments and remarks about finding the mother tree and the connection that we have with nature, and that's in part informed the decision to do the Endangered Week back in February, and this week as well. It's an invitation to remind all of us about our relationship with nature and the kind of relationship we want to have with Mother Earth. And I spent several hours on Sunday in honor of Mother's Day here in the US out in nature, just honoring Mother Earth. And it was a fun way to kick off the week.
Yeah, Jim, I don't know if you know, but there's a wonderful resort in Northern California called the Mother Tree Resort. And it has one of the most spectacular mother trees that I've ever had the privilege of being around. So at some point you might want to take your book and go visit it.
I'll look it up. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome John Perkins with us today to be in dialogue. And we entitled the session today about the death economy. And if we hold that nature has its needs, society has its needs, and then there are economic needs, then the needs of the economy have consumed the needs of nature and society. And there's no one better to talk about moving from that death economy, as John has called it, to a life economy. And that's part of the conversation we want to have today. And what are the things that have prevented us from doing the right thing, us being political leaders, industry leaders, and moving to striking balance between the needs of nature, humanity, economically, and humanity as a society. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be with you guys, and thank you for the amazing work that you're all doing. Really appreciate it.
So John,
Back at you, as they say. Back at you, yes.
John, I'll share a little bit about your bio for the members of our audience who are unfamiliar with your work. Certainly your Confessions of an Economic Hitman that was released in 2004, and then the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman released in 2016 are part of what you're known for, but you're also a shaman. You spent time in Latin America with the Peace Corps. You have written a number of books about your shamanic journeys and nature. And so you're one of the few people on the planet who really understand both the economics and nature. And we'd love to engage you in that conversation today and have you share your wisdom about what is the death economy, what has it done to the planet, and what is the life economy, and what does the transition look like?
Thank you, Tom. I'd really like to start, given what Jim said about communication with plants. I start by mentioning that when I was a child growing up in New Hampshire, my dad taught at a boys' boarding school in rural New Hampshire. And he got about close to 3 months off in the summer as a teacher. And we spent that time in a little cottage on a lake in the forests of New Hampshire. And we had no neighbors in those days. It was very rural. I'm an only child. There were no other children. And so I spent my days in the woods or sometimes or out on the lake in a canoe or a raft that I built, talking to the trees and to the fish. They were my only friends, and I love the stories of King Arthur and Robin Hood and those kind of things. And I'd be in the forest, and each tree, the one tree over here would be Maid Mary, and this tree over here would be Friar. And I would talk to them, and they would talk back. And it was very, very real for me. I had no idea at the time that later I would be living in the Amazon. And incidentally, I still go back every year. People are welcome to come with me this December. I'm taking a group down. But, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer deep in the Amazon with the Shuar people, who were hunters and gatherers at the time, living very traditional lives, and they taught me about the spirits of the trees and how they constantly talk, how they know what different plants they use for different things by having talked to those plants. And it was so interesting that, suddenly what I thought maybe I was crazy, other kids would, if they saw me talking to, I didn't let them see me talking to the trees, but if they ever caught me talking to trees, they would think I was crazy. And suddenly I'm living in a culture where it's common practice, where everybody knows that the trees have spirit, the plants have spirit, the animals have spirit, and we're all connected. And these people believed in past and future lives, but they didn't believe that your past and future lives were necessarily human. In fact, one of the best things to become was a tree, a big vine, an ayahuasca vine, or a kapok tree. So the trees were, human life was considered to be an incredibly difficult learning experience. And being a tree or being a jaguar or an anaconda was, or almost anything else, was superior to being human. We had to come as humans to learn how to behave in a way that was responsible, given the fact that they all knew that humans are the only ones that can really destroy all of life. And therefore, it's a huge responsibility and a learning experience.
Yeah, thank you for starting the conversation there, John. In our discussions yesterday with Jojo Mehta from Stop Ecocide International and Charles Eisenstein, Charles talked about the need for starting the conversation in nature and reminding people about our connection with nature. And if the discussion starts there, then anything's possible.
Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things I write about is how one of the characteristics of the death economy is that we see ourselves as apart from rather than a part of nature. And throughout most of human history, 250,000 years or so, we've always lived, every one of us comes from a heritage where we knew that we were a part of nature. And it's only been within the last blink of an eye, historically speaking, that we've seen ourselves as apart from, as superior to. In recent times, I've done a lot of talk about superiority as it relates to different races and cultures and so forth, and colonialism. And that's all true, and it needs to be addressed. But perhaps even another problem is that we see ourselves as superior to nature, not part of nature. We, in fact, have defined ourselves as aliens, where we've alienated ourselves from nature. When you say you are apart from, you're an alien. We are aliens on our own planet.
John, it's interesting. I grew up in New England as well, more in Massachusetts than in New Hampshire. But as a boy, I lived on a little lake, and I had my little boat, and I would go off and lay on the deck and look down into the water at the fish and the turtles and up at the trees. And I think in many, many ways, it was the most content, whole part of my life. And it's terrifying to think of the number of people that do not have that as a grounding or an experience to build a life on,
Yeah.
So tell us about the death economy and how it has been impeding our world.
Yes, well, I have to start by saying that, I have to take some responsibility for this, because as I was the chief economist at this major consulting firm during the 70s, of what we knew ourselves as economic hitmen. Part of our major part of our job was to promote what's become what we've now call a death economy. And it's an economic system that's built on the goal of maximizing short-term materialistic consumption and short-term corporate profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs, regardless of the destruction that can cause to the environment, to nature, and to humans. Short-term maximization of profits and consumerism. And it's created an economic situation globally that's essentially consuming itself into extinction, thus a death economy. It's a dying economy because in the short term, we're consuming the very things that we need for the long term. And in corporations, most executives in a big corporation don't expect to be there for very long. Longevity is not a part of the job. So their total focus is on maximizing short-term profits, and that often means destroying the resources that very corporation's long-term sustainability depends upon, as well as the long-term sustainability of all of us on the planet. So a death economy is one that's destroying itself, and we're living in it now. It's also an economic system that to a very large degree is based on a war. What's the United States economy without its military industrial complex? It's a large part of it. And it's a large part of the global economy is war, or the threat of war, the preparation for war, the money that goes into it. While we're all rooting for Ukraine, we also have to understand that there's these huge corporations in the United States and elsewhere that are making immense profits off this war. They can talk about their ulterior, their better motives of defending Ukraine and defending freedom and standing up to Russia, which we all know we all must do. But at the same time, these corporations, and this includes the oil companies, are making huge, huge profits off this war, as they did in Vietnam, as they did in Afghanistan. So that's part of the death economy also, and we need to turn that around, because ultimately, we all know it's what's causing climate change, inequality of income, species extinctions, the pandemic, all the crises that we're facing today are symptoms of this death economy.
John, we had in February, we had Dr. Sylvia Earle as one of our guests. And when posed the question, what brings you hope? She shared that she was hopeful because we finally realized in the last 2 decades, we're living on a finite planet. And yesterday, Jojo Mehta from Stop Ecocide International shared that the leaders she's meeting with privately are saying, please put ecocide on the global standing in the international criminal courts as a criminal act like genocide, to help give us some guidance and help us do the right thing. And if we look at those 2 conversations and comments in particular from Dr. Earle, that we're living on a finite planet and creating ecocide as an international crime, it's putting some structures in place. It's putting the reality of the planet in place. And it feels to me like those are 2 potential possibilities for stopping the death economy and inviting in the life economy.
It's a good point. I've been blessed by the opportunity since these books have come out to speak at a lot of different types of venues, ranging from big international economic summits in places like Kazakhstan and Russia a couple of years ago, to rock concerts and environmental and consumer organizations. And everywhere I go, I hear that people are waking up, that they're understanding of this problem. And that includes CEOs of major corporations. And I can't begin to tell you how often I've heard from executives at big corporations that they want to do the right thing. They want they want to make their companies greener. They say, you know, I've got grandkids, you know, we've got to do better. And then they'll say, but you know, I've got to be really careful, because if my corporation loses market share, or the stock price goes down for a fairly short period of time, the top stockholders in my company will fire me. And they will replace me with someone who only cares about market share or stock prices. So I've got to stay in here and do the best I can, but I've got to be careful. I've got to realize that Wall Street is my real boss. And you know, there's a few exceptions, privately owned companies, but they've got their own set of issues. And so these executives will often tell me, hey, tell your public, tell all the listeners to this program that we're on, you know, pick out a corporation that you want to see changed. Let's say you zero in on Nike. And actually, Mark Parker, the president of Nike, is one of the people who said this. And write an email to Nike and say, and make it short, but say, I love your product. I love your tennis shoes. And I want to have you be the most successful company in the world. So therefore, I'm not going to buy your tennis shoes anymore until you start paying your workers in Indonesia a living wage, or until you make sure you get rid of all the oil-based glues in your tennis shoes. Something along those lines. And then they say, so, you know, send that email to us, and then send it out to all your social networking circles, and ask them to send it to us, and ask them to send it to all their social networking circles. And these executives will say, if I have letters like this, I can then go to my executive committee, I can go to my major stockholders and say, hey, we've got to listen to our consumers. We may lose a little money in the short run. Our stock prices may go down a little bit. Our market share might drop a bit, but in the end, we're going to be extremely successful. We're going to be the leader in our field. And that's what we want for this corporation. And I think it's really important to understand that many of these executives want to do the right thing, but they're highly restricted. And we consumers and investors and the people who work for the companies, we have a lot of power, and we need to turn these things around. And I'd like to just very quickly add, Tom, that I know there are some sociopaths that run corporations that don't give a damn about any of this. But sociopaths are not driven by profit, they're driven by success. And right now, success is defined as profit. And as long as we do that, define that the goal of corporations is to maximize short-term profits, as that's what the sociopaths would want to do. But if we start putting on the cover of Forbes magazine and the Time magazine's Person of the Year, people like you guys, people who are promoting a life economy, then the sociopaths will buy into it very quickly.
You know, John, it's interesting because most people don't talk about the pressures that executives in corporations face, the good ones at least. And what many of us don't talk about is that we do have that leverage, not just as consumers, but as shareholders. We're oftentimes the first ones who yell when the value of our stocks go down, and we forget the fact that we're the ones that are placing demands on people that are running companies. And if we would take more responsibility about what we invest in and what we support, that also is a way, I think, of going from a death economy to a life economy. It's the same in politics. We complain that politicians are for sale, but we're amongst the first ones that want to buy their attention. And if we would stop that, we could have great influence on our time.
Yeah, George, I totally agree with you. But you know, there's this perception, and let's talk a little bit about perception. You know, I think one of the things that it's interesting that I'd taken philosophy courses in college and so forth, and I remember a college professor talking about perception one time, and he's saying, well, this table isn't really real. It's just as I perceive it. And I thought, well, this guy's crazy. But then I got to live with these amazing people who live very close to Earth, who see themselves as part of nature, and yet they understand how important perception is. You know, I talk in some of my books about how a shaman saved my life by changing my perception. We need to realize that reality is molded by perception. There is no United States, there's no Russia, there's no culture, there's no religion, there are no corporations except as we perceive them. And when enough people accept a perception or codify it into law, it has a huge impact on reality. And so today we have this perception that success is defined by materialistic consumption and profits, short-term profits. You know, who makes the most money, who does the best of this, who does, I mean, this even carries over to sports, you know, or what quarterback made the most money last year, that kind of thing. This perception of the way we define things. So to create a life economy, we need to move to a new perception that says that success is about maximizing long-term benefits for people and nature. And that that's how we measure it. And that we pay people then to clean up pollution, you know, to figure out ways to mine all the plastic that's floating around in the oceans and use it, reuse it, to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, to create new technologies that and develop them that don't ravage the earth. You know, we've been moving in that direction, and that's why I'm hopeful, because I've seen movement in that direction. We've seen the Green New Deal, we've seen conscious capitalism, we've seen B corporations, benefit corporations. We've seen some of the people you've mentioned earlier on the show. Charles Eisenstein is a good example of someone who's become very popular quite quickly in a short amount of time, particularly with younger people. And I love Charles, he's a good friend, you know, talking about these things. So people are talking about these things all over the world. And as I travel around the world, I hear this everywhere. There is a consciousness revolution. And that's the first step, is to become conscious and to start looking at the perception. And then you've got to start taking actions that reflect the new perception.
John, can you talk about some of the actions beyond what you've already shared that need to be taken to get us out of the tyranny of the systems and the institutions that are in place, beyond just some of the comments you made about Wall Street?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, you know, I don't need to go into the details about how all of us ought to use a lot less plastic, and we ought to consume a lot less. We, you know, buy things that'll last longer, let them last longer, cut way back on eating meat, or don't eat it. And there's all, you know, I mean, there's all these ideas out there. I think for everybody to be part of some sort of a consumer movement that is so easy these days with social networking, like I described, write a letter to a corporation, pick any corporation that you'd want to see changed, and don't just sit back and say, geez, these guys ought to change. Send them emails and circulate that amongst all your circles of friends and their circles of friends. And I think beyond that, I like to say that each one of us has our own particular role to play. And I don't know what anybody's individual role is, but I like to suggest to people, and this is in my next book, 5 questions we can ask ourselves. Do you want me to go into those?
Yes.
Sure.
Well, and I'll give a couple of examples for each one. So the first question is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest satisfaction, the greatest bliss? Because unless we do what we really want to do, we're not really going to be successful, and we're going to have burnout. So for me, I would say, I want to write. I love to write. That's what I want to do for the rest of my life. I have a good friend who's a carpenter, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. He doesn't want to write. He wants to work with his hands and wood. And there's everybody in between. So you define that. What do you most want to do? And the second question is, how can I do that in a way that'll help others, that'll help transfer the death economy to a life economy? For me as a writer, I'd say I'm going to write about these things. I want to inspire people to get involved in this. My friend, the carpenter, would say, I'm going to use sustainable materials in everything I build. The third question is, What stands in your way? What's the blockage? What's keeping you from doing this? Now, someone who wants to write a book might say, well, I don't have time. I know I need to write every day and I just don't have time to do that. If I want to be a successful writer, I've got to put in 8 hours a week at least writing. And my carpenter friend would say, well, my clients don't want to pay the extra price for sustainable materials. And the fourth question is, so when you really confront that blockage, when you really look at it, well, my Amazonian friends say, when you touch that jaguar, because in Vision Quest, they see a jaguar that keeps them from doing what they want to do. Which is the title of my last book, is Touching the Jaguar. When you touch that jaguar, how does it change your perception that helps you move forward? So I would say, well, wait, I could stop watching television for an hour, 3 or 4 times a week and write instead. Or I could get up half an hour earlier in the morning and write before going to work. Or I can find a way around that shortage of time. And my carpenter friend would say, I tell my clients that the extra price for sustainable materials, if there is an extra price, it's not a cost, it's an investment. They're investing in the future for themselves and their children. And the fifth question is, what actions do I take right now? You ask yourself that every single day. Okay, I got to write today. And the next question is, well, what am I going to write? And what's the first sentence? We keep going. And my carpenter friend is such, he uses sustainable materials. And he also tells his clients and he tells their children, this cabinet I built over here, this house I built for you, it's not only a beautiful house, a beautiful cabinet, but it's also an investment in your future because it was built with sustainable materials. And I think every one of us can do that. It doesn't matter what our occupation or what our vocation is, somebody, a mother or father taking care of their kids, a parent, whatever it is, we can apply that to our daily actions. So in addition to taking the actions that we can all take as communities by trying to change corporations and by consuming less, by doing all the things that we all know we should be doing, driving our cars less, et cetera, we can each one of us apply this to our personal lives.
Well, John, one of the things I appreciate about you, when you came out with Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that was a seminal book, and it opened a lot of people's eyes. And you and I met for the first time around 2016 when you had come out with the new Confessions, and you shared with me that people felt hopeless when they read Confessions. And with new Confessions, you would incorporate a lot of different pieces of information about what people could do to change the systems. And what I'm hearing in the 5 questions you just shared as part of your book coming out in February, you're giving people hope. You're giving people an opportunity to take action. And love to hear you share a bit more about that and talk about the book you've got coming out in February.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So Confessions of an Economic Hitman, 2004, I had no idea. In fact, that book was rejected by 39 publishers. It was a terrible task getting that book published. It was, imagine getting 39 rejection letters. You just want to do this. But I learned, I applied perception. I learned before that what I had to do was every time I got a rejection letter from another publisher, I had to say, well, this woman, I had an argument with her husband at breakfast. She was in a bad mood. She just threw everything into the rejection pile. And mine was the first book she saw when she came in. So she threw it in the rejection pile. Or this guy, this publisher here, he just published a book that he thinks is like this one 3 months ago. He doesn't want to do another one. I kept telling myself these editors are not gods. I can't take it personally. And that's a very different perception than I would have taken back when I first started publishing the shamanic books, and when I was much younger. I'd say, "Oh my God, if an editor doesn't like it, it must not be a good book." Well, I've learned that isn't true. And fortunately, after 39, the 40th publisher published it, and it immediately went to the New York Times bestseller list. Stayed there for I don't know, 70 some odd weeks. So it's sold many millions of copies in 30 some odd languages. And it opened this door for me to travel around the world, speaking at all kinds of different venues, as I mentioned earlier. And then the second, there were 2 books in between that were published by 2 other publishers, Random House and Penguin, and on a similar subject. And then the second Confessions, the New Confessions, came out in 2016, and things just kept mushrooming, and I kept traveling, and I kept learning. That was one of the most important aspects. I kept learning about what people were thinking and about how much they wanted guidance. And they didn't just want, these simple kind of like, oh yeah, eat less meat, drive fewer miles in your car, buy fewer clothes, hang your clothes out to dry instead of putting them in a dryer. That certainly doesn't work where I live in the state of Washington, where it rains all the time. So they wanted to go deeper into what's my personal thing, and that's why this is sort of evolved that way. But I also, I developed tremendous hope because I saw how much all over the world people are determined to change, and I also began to understand about China and what a huge influence China has on the world. I taught at an MBA college in Shanghai, which is ranked very high in the world of MBA programs. And most of the students there were Chinese students, and they were slated to be the future leaders of China. And one of the things I heard from them, which was fascinating to me, was, we've created a miracle, an economic miracle here in China. We brought close to 800 million people out of dire poverty. We had roughly 10% economic growth for almost 30 years, every year. We've done something that no other country's ever done in the history of the world, a huge miracle, but it's come at a horrible price environmentally and socially. And we young people have had to live with awful pollution. We don't intend to bring our kids up like that. We've proven that we can create a miracle. So now we're determined to create a miracle in the green revolution. We in China will be the greenest country in the world. We young people here recognize that that's essential. Now, I don't know whether they'll do it or not. And China has a lot of problems. I'm not trying to suggest that it's all bright, because it isn't. I mean, they're doing some terrible things with the Uyghurs. We all hear about that, and Taiwan and Tibet and Hong Kong and on and on and on. But what was encouraging to me was hearing these young people, and I would hear the same thing in every country, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in Kazakhstan, in Vietnam, all over Latin America, and all over the United States, young people saying, we have to turn this around. And that truly is the first step in any revolution, is to begin to recognize the extreme need and the possibilities, and to recognize that it really is all about perception. And that's when I also understood that the 2 biggest economies in the world and the 2 greatest polluters are the United States and China. And we are competing for various things, and are highly critical of each other. And it's okay to continue to be critical. It's okay to continue to compete on many levels. It's okay to disagree on just about everything, except we need to come together to agree that we've got to create a new economic system, a life economy, an economic system that does clean up pollution, regenerates destroyed environments, that looks at being a part of rather than apart from nature. And what's fascinating is that everybody, it seems to me, just about everybody in all these, and in both of those countries and most of the rest of the world, understands that today, especially the young people. You used to have to walk into a university back when the first book came in 2004, and convince people there was climate change. You don't need to do that anymore. You don't even need to address that subject. You can just go from, well, there's climate change, and let's talk about what we can do about it. So things have changed radically. And I think for the better, as far as consciousness is concerned. But we also need to recognize that whenever there's a revolution, and let's call this a consciousness revolution, there's pushback by the status quo. We're getting a lot of pushback because the status quo is scared. The oil companies are scared. The coal companies are scared. And all the politicians who represent them are scared. And, you know, good revolutionaries or good agents of change, maybe that's too strong a word. Let's call ourselves agents of change. Good agents of change always take the pushback as something to give them strength. It's a lot like martial art. I've been a martial artist all my life. And you know that if you're up against a guy who's bigger and stronger than you do not try to overpower him. You got to use his strength against him. You got to recirculate that energy to use against him. And I think good agents of change always understand that when there's pushback like we're experiencing on a very big level right now, we take energy, we take strength from it.
You know, John, your questions, the 5 questions, the optimism that you have personally experienced and you talk about, especially the commitment and the passion and of younger people who know that there's something that they need to fix, that to a large extent our generations have screwed up. Or either through omission or commission. And yet one of the things that I still experience, and what you say about optimism, most individuals who are experienced in the world and have been successful at what they do, I think, speak to. And yet there is a disconnect in that a number of really dynamic and interesting young people have decided that what has to happen when this generation fades or when this system implodes even more. And one of the things I like to speak about, your questions are what I call the power of one, that where we re-inherit our authority and our voice. What do you think about how do we not just applaud and recognize and acknowledge young people, but invite them back into the game to be those people who write those letters, who are more engaged, those that are politically, obviously in 2020, help change the game. But what advice do you have for young people who are sitting it out, waiting for us to fall asleep at the switch or disappear?
Well, that's a great question, George. And it is fascinating, the number of podcasts and virtual shows that I've been on since the pandemic, instead of literally traveling, although I'm starting to do that again. But to see how many of the participants are of our generation, my generation, or maybe 10 years younger or 10 years older. And so we're getting it. And the young people have gotten it, and many of them have gotten enough of it to be discouraged, to just sort of drop out. And I think one of the problems with my generation is that we tend to talk an awful lot about it. And we philosophize and we say, this is what should happen. And I think young people are looking for us to act, to make things happen. It's not insignificant that people like Greta and some of the strongest spokespeople today are the younger ones. Even if we look at Congress, we look at some of these younger people like OAS and others who are the leaders in taking action. And I think it's very, very important that shows like this and people like the 3 of us here, lead with action. And it's, we have to talk, but we also have to lead with action. I think we can all, or at least all of the 3 of us, can remember a time when there was huge discussion over whether solar energy would ever have a place in the energy market. And we talked and we talked and we talked, and people wrote books and wrote books. But at some point, someone had to be brave enough to start making solar panels and take the risk. And then others had to be brave enough to pay more money for them and put them on their roofs. And we could say the same thing with organic foods. People who, especially in the city, couldn't get organic foods in the great big grocery stores. And suddenly some big grocery store, and we have to credit, some Whole Foods with actually taking a lead in that. And it was a big risk. And we could say the American Revolution. People talked and talked and talked about breaking away from England. And then somebody, you mentioned you're from Massachusetts. Yeah, well, somebody had to stand on that bridge that arched the flood, as Hawthorne put it, in Concord. And they had to stand on the Lexington Green and actually take action. We're at a time like that now, where it's time to stop talking or continue to talk, but talk in ways that really inspire action. It's too late to discuss whether we should do something, or what is Congress going to do, or what is so-and-so going to do. Then the real question is, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I think we of my generation, of our generation, need to really lead by the example of getting out there and doing things, really doing things, standing on the front lines of whatever that is. And some of that would be just leading in social networking movements.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. And I think what makes it challenging or confusing for folks, and I'll just look at current events. So, Europe being so dependent upon Russian oil, and the Biden administration that ran on climate change making the decision to authorize the drilling of 1 million barrels a day, and in support of the European Union and in the risk from Russian oil, or the Commerce Department a week ago making the decision to ban Chinese solar panels. China's making 3/4 of all the solar panels on the planet, banning them for the next year. And so when those institutional governmental actions happen, I think it's very discouraging for the average citizen, the average person who's wanting to do the right thing and to take action. And how do we give them hope? How do we help them understand that our leaders are operating under the tyranny of the old systems and institutions that need to change? And how do we give them hope, and how do we help them take the actions that need to be taken?
Our leaders are operating under the tyranny of the big corporations and the maximization of short-term profit goal. It's the oil companies that are driving so much of this. They don't want to see solar panels come in from China. They want to keep selling oil. And actually, my next newsletter, which comes out today, or maybe some people receive it tomorrow, or you can get it probably not till tomorrow or the next day on my website, johnperkins.org, deals exactly with this. Big oil is making huge profits, huge profits. And they're pulling out of Russia, and they're saying that they're doing it because they don't believe in the Russian cause. I think they're doing it because they're afraid that Russia will nationalize oil there. They're afraid that the Europeans will not buy oil from them because the Europeans don't want to buy oil from Russia. And they're afraid that other countries in Africa and Latin America and so forth will rebel against them. And at the same time, they're charging us outrageously high prices at the pump and getting huge tax benefits. And we subsidize big oil, even though it's making horrendous profits. And the statistics are in this newsletter. If people care to get the statistics, go to my website and sign up for my newsletter. You can put your email. But the point is that our government in this country and in most of the world today is driven by big corporations, and they're driven by this maximized profit perception or goal. And nobody gets elected to a high position in the United States without the support, or very few people without the support of big corporations or their major stockholders, the money that comes in from them for campaign financing. And these people in Congress, many of them came out of corporations, or people in government and will go back into them, or they know that if they support corporations and they lose the next election, they'll get a very lucrative lobbying job or advisor, consultant to such and such a corporation. It's a very corrupt system, and yet corruption has been legalized. So so strictly speaking, in the United States, it isn't corruption. What people do in other countries, in Latin American countries that I spent a lot of time in, if they did some of the same things that we do in this country, it would be called corruption. It would be illegal, and we call them corrupt because they do it. We don't recognize that we are corrupt on a very, very large scale. Our corporations control so much through money, but it isn't corruption because it's been defined as non-corruption. It's been defined as part of the system. It's a terrible perception. And so I think what we can say of so much of what's going on today around Ukraine, and again, you know, I mean, what Russia's done is horrible. There's no excuse. It's outrageous. We've got a new Stalin in Putin in power there. Needs to be stopped. But I think it's also important to recognize that big corporations, including oil and the whole military industrial complex, are making huge amounts of money off this war. And they're telling us that they're suffering somehow. The oil companies are suffering, and yet their profits are greater than they've ever been. And again, those numbers are in the newsletter, and they're gouging us at the pump.
And it doesn't stop with oil, of course. You know, I mean, so many corporations today are using the pandemic and whatnot, and that is resulting in this thing they call inflation. But they're raking in huge amounts of money and raping America. And I tried to get some information through to our president to suggest that he could become a hero overnight by pulling the heads of the oil companies in and saying, look, here's the deal. We stop your incentives, we stop your special deals, or you tighten your belt and you bite the bullet at the moment. I mean, that's the kind of signal that would give people hope that maybe change is possible. We are definitely living in an extraordinary time. And what you say about the fact that what is called corruption in other places is accepted as business as usual here. Before we go around attempting to moralize to the world, it would be nice if we cleaned up our own act. You know?
Yeah, absolutely, George. And, you know, the thing about our president sitting down with the oil companies and doing this is, I agree with you, that's what needs to be done. Kennedy did it with big steel.
Yeah.
But then again, I don't want to get into that, but Kennedy didn't survive too long after that. Not that there was necessarily a connection, but who knows? I mean, the fact of the matter is, the president of the United States and all of our major politicians are in very difficult positions. You know, you can imagine that if President Biden went on the air and said, hey, we're going to work closely with China to help build the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative around the world to increase global communications. We're going to work with China to do that. What would happen to the Democratic Party? You know, I mean, that's the problem is that again, these perceptions are out there. And yeah, you know, my job as an economic hitman, I was skilled at this. And you know, we would go to presidents of countries. I would go to presidents of countries and basically say, hey, you know, take this huge loan from us and use it. I'd write these fancy reports to show that if you take this loan from us and use it to hire our corporations to build big infrastructure projects in your country, your country will prosper. All your people will prosper. And of course, our corporations make huge amounts of money. But the truth of the matter is, even though statistically my reports could truthfully say that the GDP, the measure that we use for economic growth, would increase, what I didn't realize until I'd gotten into it, because I'd been brainwashed basically in business school and by the World Bank, is that GDP really measures how well the rich are doing. Yes. It doesn't include most people. In the United States, take the United States, 3 individuals, 3 have as much wealth as half the population of this country. If those 3 individuals made 10% on their assets last year, and the rest of the country, and half the country lost 3%, the rest of the country stayed level, we would show a GDP growth of something close to 4%. It would look as though the whole country prospered, when in fact only 3 people prospered. And that's true all over the world. In some places it's much more exaggerated. And so, but we sell this perception. And I knew that if these presidents knew that if they did not buy into my ideals and accept these propositions, then there were in the background, people lurked in the background called jackals. And these are people with the CIA assets that overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. And, we have a long history of that with Allende in Chile and Mossadegh in Iran, and on and on and on. And so we've got this system that makes it very, very difficult for presidents anywhere to go against the system. And that's kind of the extreme. We don't expect our presidents to be assassinated, even though several have been, but we know that they can be assassinated politically if they go against the system, that they can be destroyed one way or another. And that's a very scary thing. But it's all because these corporations have so much power, and because all of us have basically, we're victims of the system, but we're also collaborators in the system. And a lot of it's done because we just don't understand what's going on. We're deluded. But by being collaborators, we are supporting a system that's ultimately destroying life on this planet as we know it.
Thank you.
John, just picking up on that point. So, the systems have taken a toll on nature. We've got, just looking at the data, we've lost half the topsoil on the planet in the last 150 years. We've gone from 6 trillion trees on the planet to 3 trillion. We've got 1 million species on the endangered species list. We've got 80 million climate refugees, growing to probably 200 million by the end of this decade, people who can no longer live where their homes used to be. And how bad does it have to get for the systems to change? And what is it that's going to actually cause the change? I mean, you were talking earlier about a revolution of sorts and change agents, but what are your thoughts on what will actually and what can actually change the systems?
Yeah, it's a critical question. And I think that I go back to indigenous teachers, elders, shamans, and people that I've known and worked with since the late 60s when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in South America, and continue to spend a lot of time with. They've always said, and prophecies around the world, there's the eagle and the condor of Latin America, there's the Mayan prophecy of 2012, but the prophecies, there's a Jewish prophecy and a Muslim prophecy and a Christian prophecy, and there's prophecies everywhere that tell us that we're at a very critical time. And most of these prophecies indicate that we're either going to have a calamity or we're going to change. And either way, we will change. The question is, will we do it voluntarily? Will we be smart, or will we be pushed into it? And I certainly don't have the answer to that. We're moving. I think we were moving toward creating the change voluntarily. I really do. I think there was a tremendous movement there. We've been distracted. We've been distracted by a pandemic. We're now being distracted by the war in Ukraine. And we distract ourselves easily. We blame them, and they may be with the Soviet Union back in my day. And today, right now, it's Russia, or it's maybe the Muslims, or maybe it's the homeless people. I don't know. We just, you blame them. And that's a distraction. But I also think that this is something wonderful that could occur out of all of this. The pandemic has taught us that we can change. And everybody's had to change. And everybody globally has been impacted by this one event, by this pandemic, by this tiny invisible gift from nature. Let's call it a gift. And that is not to detract from all the terrible suffering and the death and and the people that are mourning loved ones. I don't mean to negate that in any way, but I think it's taught us about globalization. It's taught us that we are all connected. And so, I remember years ago, a Quechua shaman lady from the high Andes, who I'd known for years. She has the wonderful name of Maria Juana. Maria Juana Yamberla. And one people in the group I was leading at the time, and I was translating all this, asked her, so how do we save the earth? And Maria Juana laughs and she says, the earth isn't in danger. We are, and so are a bunch of other species, but we're just like so many fleas. And if we get to be too much of a nuisance, she'll just shake us all off. And then Maria Juana points up at Imbabura, the sacred volcano, active volcano that hovers over her house. And she said, 20 years ago, that volcano was covered with an ice cap, glacier. It isn't anymore. The oceans are rising. The climates are changing. Pachamama, Mother Earth, is twitching. She hasn't shaken us off yet. She's twitching. And the special thing about this is we are smart enough as human beings to listen. We shamans are listening. People all over the world can listen. Let's get the message. Let's be part of nature. Let's listen to Pachamama. Just like at the beginning of the program when Jim Garrison mentioned how the trees communicate with each other. They're communicating with us now. Nature's communicating with us. There's no question about it. And the pandemic, I think, is part of that. The virus has come out of nature. It's communicating. And, whenever there were major earthquakes or the big fires all over the world or hurricanes, these things that we thought were once in 100-year events that seem to happen every year or so, those were all twitchings of Pachamama. And yet we pretty much took them as local events. Oh, intellectually, we may have said, oh, that's climate change. But really, we looked at it locally. We said, hey, if I survive this hurricane, the outside world is going to come to my help. Bottled water, food, they'll help us rebuild. It's local. It's local. It may be driven by maybe climate change, whatever that is. Well, the pandemic has taught us something different. It's global. We've all been impacted. Every life form on this planet, in one way or another, is impacted by this. The forests in the Amazon are being impacted by this, all over. And it's taught us that when we have to, we can change. And we can enjoy the change. We can learn to play the flute. We can write another book. We can do whatever it is that we had to do while we were self-isolating. We've all learned from this experience. So I think out of this can come hope. And I think out of the terrible invasion by Putin's Russia in the Ukraine, it's also taught us, it's brought European countries together with the United States. And I think it's going to move us further toward a sustainable energy. This idea that Europe can't be dependent on Russian oil. Yes, maybe the United States is going to increase its oil production. The oil companies are going to put a lot of pressure on us and other places to do more fracking, to do all these things. But at the same time, I think most of the European countries are really understanding that they need to move deeper and deeper into alternative energy, into solar and wind and forms that we haven't even really developed yet. So hopefully there'll be that benefit if we allow it, if we push for it, if we constantly send out the message that our perception has to be that these catastrophes, the pandemic, the Russian invasion, open the door for a new understanding, help us learn that we must move in a new direction.
I also think, John, that something that you spoke about before is another critical ingredient, and that's action. I think that what we forget as citizens, as we the people, is that we have much more power than we exercise. And one of the things we seem to be afraid of is we're afraid of paying a short-term price in order to get a long-term gain. And I believe I'm at heart a revolutionary. I'm not an evolutionary. And I believe that at the moment, were we the people literally to decide to create, I call them days of resolve, where people would sit in, they would strike, they would march, they would protest, they would, in fact, signal to those in power that we have the ability to bring this economy to a dead halt, and that we would be willing to do that for as long as it takes until that government or that institution decides to exercise and change. So I think action, whether it's our generation or younger generations, is a really key answer to your question, Tom. Because if we don't act, if we keep letting this drama play out as if we were watching a performance of some kind, and we're not interacting in it, and we're not affecting it, then I think we're just going to collude in our own demise. For all of the optimism and all of the extraordinary work that so many people are doing as individuals, it is the collective we, I think, that needs to make a difference.
Yeah, incredibly important to act. As I said earlier, all of these major changes in history, whether it's moving toward organic food or solar energy or the American Revolution, you name it, it's come from actions. And to get the perception change, yes, we need this, and then the action. I'm always struck. I love history. As like you, George. I grew up in New England, where history was a huge part of my life, and my family goes back. They fought in the American Revolution, and I've always been very fascinated by how in 1774, most Americans believed that the British were invincible. You couldn't fight them. And then George Washington stood up before the Continental Congress, and he remembered 20 years earlier at the Battle of the Monongahelas during the French and Indian War, which a lot of Americans don't even know anything about. But having grown up in that part of the world, I know a lot about it. My ancestors were in that too. The French and Indian War, the Battle of the Monongahelas, England's most famous, most important, most capable general, Braddock, took a large army headed toward what became Detroit through the wilderness. It's called the Battle of the Wilderness or the Battle of the Monongahela. And he was defeated by a much smaller army of Indians and French leaders. And Washington was there, and Braddock was killed. Most all of his officers were killed. Washington was one of the few exceptions. And so 20 years later, 1774, end of 74, Washington stands up and he says, hey, the British aren't invincible. All we got to do is hide behind trees. It changed the perception.
Yes.
And it was true. That's how the revolution was won. And that's how, even though we had mentioned earlier Lexington and Concord, those were actually American defeats. But the British marched back to Boston in these huge lines of redcoats, big targets. And the Americans hid behind trees and fences and picked them off. And so actually those battles were, in the end, they were victories for the American side, because it showed the Americans what they could do by fighting unfairly, as the British called it. That's not fair. You can't fight like that. You can't fight like that. That's just not fair. That's not gentlemanly.
Isn't that what the Ukrainians just proved around Kyiv?
Right.
Hiding behind trees.
Right. And I hate to say it, but that's what the North Vietnamese proved during the Vietnam War too. That they, and it's proven over and over again that the real chess master is the one who pulls a sneak attack from someplace. But I mean, first you had to have that change of perception. You had to have Washington stand up and say, hey, that's a faulty perception. They're not invincible. I've seen them badly beaten by a much smaller force. And this is how you do it. And then you take the actions to make it happen. And that's true with whatever we're talking about. And it's true today that if we want to move into this life economy, we're going to have to change the perception and then the actions. And I think most people have already got the perceptual change in the backs of their minds, if not in the front of their minds. B corporations, benefit corporations, Green New Deal, conscious capitalism, all these things. And, in August of 2019, at the Business Roundtable, 192 of the world's most powerful corporate executives got together and they said, we can no longer be driven solely by the profit motivation. We have to take care of our customers and our employees and the communities where we work. And we must do that. But then they had to go out and face the reality of Wall Street. And so it's up to us, the consumers, the investors, as you mentioned, the employees, the people who work for the companies, all of us to come together and make sure that we force them to do what they've already said they believe and they know they must do. But we've got to force them to do it.
I was going to suggest, Tom, should we invite Jim back in for this last segment? I'm sure he's bursting at the seams with questions. What do you think?
Yeah, especially with where you tied it all so nicely together there, John. Thank you.
Yeah, I just mentioned one more thing, and that is at the end of World War II, or before he passed away, Franklin Roosevelt invited the leaders of the automakers unions, to the White House, and he talked to them, and as they were leaving the Oval Office, he said to them, I think you know that I'm on your side. I want to do what you want me to do, but you're going to have to go out there now and get the rank and file to force me to do it. Because otherwise I'm not going to get it through Congress.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to make it happen. Know that I'm with you, but you've got to make it happen. And I think a lot of corporate executives are feeling exactly that way today. And a lot of politicians too. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you. Splendid dialogue, everyone. In the few minutes we've got left, John, I want to focus on your notion of changing perception. And that to me is the shamanic pathway. And because it's the shaman that holds a certain perception that includes both nature and society. And the shaman, as you know better than most, is sort of a mediator, a translator between the natural order and the social order. And so as we bring this to a close today, I would love to hear more of your pathway into the shamanic domain, because I think as we're considering Tom, hope, George, the power of one, what we can do, I can't think personally of a more powerful process for any of us to go through than the way of the shaman, because that embodies everything that humanity needs, and also most fundamentally is about a change in perception. So we'd just love to have you speak to us about how you, as a senior executive in one of the big multilateral institutions of the planet, found your way into the forest.
Yeah, well, good question, Jim. Thank you. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer, deep in the Amazon, very deep, and living with the Shuar people who were hunters and gatherers, lived very traditional lives at the time. And I got extremely ill. I was dying. I couldn't keep any food down. There's no question. I was dying. I couldn't even stand up. And the nearest medical facility was an incredibly difficult 3-day trip from where I was. It was involved a day of walking through a very dense jungle, and then 2 days of riding in rickety old buses, if I could find one, up to the nearest medical facility. No way I could do that. And so one night, this shaman came to me and offered to heal me. So he was speaking Shuar. I spoke some Spanish. There was a school teacher there who was the only other person in town who could speak Spanish and was translating. And, this shaman was this tiny guy. He was short, but very scary looking. I mean, he's covered with tattoos. His face was covered with tattoos, and he was scary. He was essentially naked, except for a loincloth. And yeah, I'm like, this guy can heal me, but that's the only choice. I mean, what are you going to do? So I agreed. And that night, he took me on this shamanic journey. And on that journey, he at one point he's making music, he's chanting, and I'm like seeing all these visions. He's actually used a local plant as a helper in all of this, and I'm on this shamanic journey, and he suddenly, through the translator, says, "Touch the jaguar." And I open my eyes. It's the middle of the night in the middle of the forest, and there's you can hear jaguars at night. And I'm like, oh my God, where's the jaguar? I'm supposed to touch a jaguar? And he says, no, close your eyes and see the jaguar. So I close my eyes, and this face of a jaguar appears before me in my vision. And then I heard this voice, and it was like my mother's voice saying, "Son, the food and drink will kill you." Well, people in the Amazon don't drink water because the rivers they know are filled with organic matter. It's not safe to drink them. And so they drink something called chicha, which is a kind of beer that the women make by chewing and spitting manioc root. And then it ferments and sets up an alcoholic process. And then you can add water, spit beer. And they eat some very strange foods, squirming white grubs that come out of dead logs, etc. I'm drinking a lot of spit beer because you got to rehydrate a lot in the Amazon. Eating a lot of squirming white grubs. And what I realized on that journey was every time I did that, I hear this voice, "It'll kill you." At the same time, I saw how incredibly robust and healthy the Shuar are. I mean, the men have legs and muscles that Rambo would be envious of, and the women are amazing, just incredible. I was in my early 20s. The women were looking really good. And people lived to be very old if they weren't killed in a hunting accident or died at birth. And so I realized that night that it wasn't the food and drink that was killing me, because it was making them healthy. It was my perception. It was my mindset. And then a couple of days later, the shaman said, I heal you, you owe me, you need to become my apprentice. I graduated from business school. I had no desire to be a shaman's apprentice. There was no future in that in those days. But he saved my life. So I spent the next 2 years as his apprentice. And, what I kept learning over and over. And then I later studied with shamans in Indonesia and Iran and Egypt and all over Latin America and North America. And everywhere I studied with shamans, I learned they all have the same belief that perception creates reality. And perception, our mindsets are what drive us. And, I realized too that that's what modern psychotherapy is based on. Quantum physics, business, corporations, marketing, politics, they're all based on perception. So our hope is that we can reach out to people and change the perception of what it means to be successful humans on this planet. And that's the message from the shamans. We've got to honor those trees that are behind you, Jim, and where you're sitting, and that you so adequately talked about in the book you've been reading. And so that, we must listen to nature. And we are at this critical point in time where nature is speaking so loudly and clearly to us. The plants are speaking, and people are interested in mushrooms and ayahuasca and all these plant substances, but also more and more people becoming vegetarians, vegans, and we understanding that our medicines come from plants. And people are, the plant world is speaking to us. The bee world is speaking to us. The insect world, by dying off, is speaking to us, and the birds are dying off because of that. We're getting it. And that's changing our perceptions. Now we've got to take the actions.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you. Tom, do you want to, any final thoughts, George? And then maybe we'll circle back to John again.
Yeah, just maybe building off of it. I mean, one of the wonderful things that I've been observing is how science is catching up with all of this indigenous wisdom. And so, we now know that the average body is hit with 400 billion pieces of information per second. and the human brain can only process 2,000 of those 400 billion. And we get to choose what those 2,000 are, not completely, but in large part. And so the science is validating that we can choose the reality we see and we experience, and the perceptions that we experience. And John, what I so appreciate about you is how you've lived in both of those worlds of the shamanic world and the economic world, and you've harvested the wisdom from both and brought it together in a way that people can understand. So thank you.
And I as well, John, want to tell you that it's a pleasure spending time in this kind of intimate communication and conversation. And I think the reason we do these dialogues is exemplified by what's gone on here today. That there's a goodness, a graciousness, a new level of understanding that we're able to communicate through each other and with each other. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to others. And I invite those of you who are watching and listening today to take time in true dialogue, dialogos, to arrive at greater understanding, through listening and through engaging, because this is the real meat and potatoes, I think. So thanks, John. I really appreciate being with you.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you, Tom, George, and Jim, for doing what you do, for making this happen. And I guess I would just like to end for myself by saying that, for so much of the time that I was an economic hitman, I believed in what I did because the schools taught us that was the right way to do things. And I think one of the lessons here is that we've all got to look for the story behind the story. We're all, the propaganda machine is very, very strong. Our educational system teaches us basically to buy into this system. And we really need to look for the story behind the story. And I think we should all feel very, very blessed that we live in this time because we have the opportunity to turn things around. It's a time that's been prophesized by cultures throughout the world, and we're all part of it. So let's enjoy it. Let's make the best of it. Let's do it. Let's take the actions and realize that we are very, very blessed. We're special to be living at this time, and let's not let it go to waste. Let's do it and enjoy the process.
Thank you so much, John. Tom, before we close out, just give us a word on tomorrow.
Sure. Tomorrow we've got a wonderful group of panelists who are joining us from Wild Earth Guardians. We've got their executive director, their conservation director, and their Western Mountain Region advocate talking about their work they're doing, working within the systems, the legal systems, to protect and preserve nature. And it will be a fun conversation to hear some from folks who are on the ground, but working within the systems to preserve and protect what's happening here in the Mountain States in the western part of the U.S.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, in closing, everyone, I just want to say what I said to John while we were in the green room before the program started, and that is that his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I consider one of the more important books that I've read. And I would encourage everyone to look it up and read it, because it's an inside story of a man who believed in what he was doing and then came to the realization that he was actually destroying entire countries because he was participating in a profit machine and ultimately a war machine. And I want to acknowledge your mastery, John, and your willingness and your courage to write a book that was an expose on, one of the most closely guarded secrets of our time, that the entire economic structure in which we live and breathe and have our being has an infusion of corruption that is taking us off the cliff. And I want to just note just very quickly that I would say this pertains to what's happening in Ukraine. And next week, we're going to have a whole session on Ukraine, because what we're being told about Ukraine is the opposite of the reality. That's how good the propaganda is. And that's why the change of perception is so fundamentally important for us to take on as a personal and collective challenge, because we are in a world of extremely sophisticated spin masters. And so when we talk about the war machine and we talk about the pathway to regeneration through shamanic practice, we need to understand, I believe, that we're in it. It's not something separate from us. And so next, I think it's going to be next Tuesday, we're going to go into just the example of Ukraine and bring to bear certain things that will challenge perception. But that's required for us to gain deeper insight into truth. And John, you were one of the pioneers in the revelation of the war machine. And I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for it, and wish you all the best, and encourage everyone to go on to johnperkins.org for his newsletter. It's important work in the world. And we all need to inform ourselves so that we can make the kind of difference required to secure our future. So that does it for us for today, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan has made available to you. And then we'll see you all tomorrow for day 3 of this 5-day program on Endangered, looking at the situation from the lens of Wild Earth Guardians. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now. See you tomorrow.